Maybe you've heard the name Jerusalem's lost heir somewhere before, in a documentary, in a half-remembered story, or even in a conspiracy forum. But here's the thing. Most people have no idea what it actually means. Let's start simple. Think of a family tree. Each branch is a generation, each leaf a child. Now imagine one branch suddenly cut off, erased, as if it never existed. That's the story we're walking into. The mystery of a bloodline that some claim was erased from history, yet secretly guarded by one of the most powerful brotherhoods Europe ever knew. The Knights Templar. Back in the Middle Ages, kings and popes argued over who had the right to rule the Holy Land. But behind the wars and the banners, there were whispers that the bloodline of Jerusalem had not vanished with the fall of the last king. That somewhere, someone still carried that royal blood. The Templars weren't just warriors with swords and crosses. They were guardians of secrets, bankers of empires, and, if some records are to be believed, protectors of this hidden heir. Here's the strange part. In certain old chronicles, there are sudden gaps. A king's son who is mentioned once and then never again. A missing baptism record. A shadow in the line of succession. And every time you find one of these gaps, you also find the Templars nearby, stationed in that region, keeping unusually close watch. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you this. If you stumbled across proof of a hidden royal heir, would you tell the world, or would you protect the secret no matter what? Let's go back for a moment to the city of Jerusalem itself. Picture narrow streets buzzing with traders, the smell of spice and smoke in the air, pilgrims moving through the gates, banners of crusaders flapping in the dry wind. It wasn't just a holy city, it was the prize of kings. Whoever claimed Jerusalem claimed not only land, but legitimacy. When the last Christian king of Jerusalem fell, official records said his line ended. Historians wrote the final chapter and closed the book. But some accounts don't add up. There are mentions in letters, in church archives, of a child who was taken away quietly, out of the city, before the crown collapsed. Who could have arranged that? Well, who had the money, the ships, the soldiers, and the silence to make such a thing possible? The Knights Templar. They weren't just on the battlefield. They ran networks that stretched from the Holy Land to Paris, from castles in Portugal to ports in Italy. If anyone could smuggle a blood heir out of a burning city, it was them. Now, the question isn't just did the heir survive, but why would the Templars care so much? You see, for the Templars, protecting a secret wasn't unusual. They were trusted with treasures, letters, entire fortunes. But a living heir, that was something else. That was a gamble with history itself. And here's where the trail gets interesting. After the fall of Jerusalem, certain noble families in Europe suddenly grew powerful, almost overnight. Lands, wealth, titles appearing out of nowhere. Some scholars argue that this was nothing but luck, but others whisper, maybe it was the blood of Jerusalem, hidden in plain sight, married into Europe's ruling houses, watched carefully by men in white cloaks with red crosses. Imagine it. The lost heir walking through a French marketplace, no crown, no throne, just another face in the crowd. But behind him, unseen, the Templars keeping watch. So the story shifts from the battlefield to something far more fragile. A child, a secret, and a brotherhood sworn to protect it. If the story of a hidden heir sounds like legend, the question is, where do you even begin to look for proof? Strangely enough, the trail doesn't vanish in the desert. It reappears in Europe, quietly, like a shadow slipping into the corner of a room. Not long after the fall of Jerusalem, chronicles in France and Portugal mention the sudden rise of certain families. Their names didn't carry the weight of kings before, but within a generation, they owned lands, commanded knights, and married into circles close to thrones. Historians call it the mystery of the new nobility. But to those who dig deeper, there's another explanation. The Templars placed the heir in their care, weaving his bloodline into the roots of Europe. There's one letter, found centuries later in a monastery archive, written by a Templar knight who had served in the Holy Land. He spoke not of treasure or relics, but of the living flame of David's house, carried west under God's command. Most readers skipped over it, assuming it was religious poetry. But what if it was a coded reference to a child of royal descent? And then there are the castles. Across France, Spain, and Portugal, the Templars built fortresses unlike any others. Some stood on trade routes, yes, but others were in strangely remote places. Why defend valleys no army would ever cross? Some researchers whisper, those fortresses were safe houses, not for gold, not for relics, but for blood. Picture this: a lonely keep on a windswept hill in southern France. To the villagers below, it was just another Templar garrison. But inside its stone walls, perhaps a child was raised in secrecy, learning not to act like a king, but to survive as a shadow. That is the genius of the Templars' plan, if it was real. You don't protect a throne by parading it. You protect it by making sure no one sees it at all. And so, by the time the 13th century rolled into the 14th, Europe may have been walking alongside the blood of Jerusalem without even knowing. Farmers sold them grain, nobles dined with them, merchants shook their hands, yet no one knew the true weight of their veins. It wasn't a crown anymore. It was a secret, beating quietly beneath the surface of Europe. Of course, secrets don't stay silent forever. In whispers, in broken seals of letters, in the patterns of marriage alliances, rumors began to leak. Some monks copied strange lines into their chronicles. A seed of Zion walks among the lilies of the West. At first it was dismissed as allegory, a metaphor for faith, but in courts where politics was life and death, even a metaphor could be dangerous. The Vatican, ever watchful, started to notice. Reports trickled in from inquisitors and bishops. Why did certain Templar castles guard no borders, yet consume so many resources? Why did families of no royal birth suddenly rise with uncanny speed, protected by Templar arms? And why, above all, did whispers of a bloodline keep returning, like a song sung too often to be coincidence? Some in Rome feared heresy. Others feared something greater: legitimacy. If even a fragment of David's bloodline still lived, and if the Templars guarded it, then what claim did popes or kings truly have over Christendom? Imagine how destabilizing it would be. Armies might rally not to Rome, but to a forgotten heir. There is one chilling note, preserved in the Vatican's secret registers. It reads simply, "Investigate the matter of the child." No name, no date, just those 6 words. The kind of sentence that weighs more than volumes. From that moment, the game changed. What had been a hidden duty for the Templars was now a hunt for the Vatican. 2 powers, both sworn to God, circling each other in suspicion. And so, as Europe entered the years before the infamous Friday the 13th in 1307, when the Templars would be broken, a deeper story ran beneath the surface. Not about money, not about idols, but about a bloodline, Jerusalem's last echo, hidden in plain sight. If that heir was real, then the Templars weren't just warriors or bankers. They were guardians of a throne no one was allowed to sit on. And Rome, perhaps, wasn't willing to share the stage. Rome was never a place that needed proof before it acted. Suspicion alone was enough. And by the late 13th century, suspicion was thick in the corridors of the Vatican like incense after a high mass. Picture the papal chambers at night, the marble walls glowing faintly by candlelight. Long scrolls stacked on a table, seals dangling, red wax like drops of dried blood. A handful of cardinals leaned close, their voices hushed not out of reverence, but out of fear that someone else might overhear. The question was not if the rumors of a bloodline were true, but what if they were? What if the Templars were building more than fortresses? What if their treasure was not gold, but a person, a living heir whose existence could undo centuries of papal authority? So the Vatican did what it had always done best. It set its network of eyes and ears into motion. Monks who could travel unnoticed. Bishops who owed their red hats to favors. Merchants who carried more than spices in their wagons. A shadow army moved quietly, recording strange marriages, noble houses that suddenly rose in fortune, children with curious protection from the temple. There is a record, tucked away in the Vatican's secret archive, that speaks of a letter sent from Avignon to Rome. It warned, "The temple hides not relics of stone, but flesh and blood. Watch their households. Follow the children." Think about that for a moment. The greatest religious institution on earth wasn't chasing ghosts or gold, it was chasing children. That single detail shifts the entire story. Meanwhile, in the streets of Paris, whispers began to change. Tavern talk turned to envy. Why do the Templars eat well when we starve? But somewhere deeper among the educated elite, the whispers grew darker. Perhaps they protect someone who should not be alive. It was a dangerous convergence. Popular resentment fueled by hunger. Vatican paranoia fueled by fear of losing control. And in the middle stood the Templars, men sworn to secrecy, guarding something they dared not name. By the time the 14th century dawned, the stage was set. It would not be the sins of greed or pride alone that doomed the order. It was the suspicion of a secret bloodline, one too dangerous to exist in the open. The Vatican's quiet hunt had begun, and the Templars, though they knew the net was tightening, refused to let go of what they guarded. If you wanted to bring down the most powerful brotherhood in Christendom, you wouldn't start with swords. You'd start with whispers. The Vatican knew this well. Around 1302, subtle tests began. A papal envoy would arrive at a Templar commandery, not with soldiers, but with questions disguised as blessings. "Tell me, Brother Knight, what relics do you hold? Do you have proof of the true cross, or something greater?" The questions seemed innocent, but every answer was weighed, measured, and carried back to Rome. If a knight stammered, if he hesitated too long, it was written down. If he spoke with too much confidence, that too was marked. At the same time, merchants loyal to the Pope began to weave rumors in the markets. They whispered that the Templars worshipped in secret at night, that strange rituals took place behind closed doors, that their chapels smelled not of incense, but of smoke and fear. The brilliance of the plan was simple. The Vatican never had to accuse the Templars directly. All it had to do was create enough doubt that kings and commoners alike began to ask, "What if it's true?" But the traps were not only words. There are stories, half buried in legal records, of forged documents sent to Templar houses, letters that looked as if they came from within the order, speaking of a hidden child, a bloodline, or even a pact with powers no priest should name. When these letters were discovered by papal eyes, they became evidence, even if the ink was Vatican's own. Imagine the pressure inside the Templar halls. Brothers who once trusted each other with their lives now eyed one another with suspicion. Who spoke to the envoy? Who might be the spy? Who among us slipped the wrong word? And yet through all this, the Templars held their silence. If there truly was a secret heir, if there truly was blood worth protecting, then words could not be allowed to betray it. Better to endure slander than to risk revelation. Still, silence cuts both ways. To outsiders, refusal to defend oneself looked like guilt, and the Vatican was patient. Each rumor was another stone, each letter another weight. Slowly, the walls of reputation that the Templars had built over 2 centuries began to crack. It was not steel that would break them first, but doubt. And once doubt took root, all it needed was a single storm to bring the fortress down. The whispers of Jerusalem's fall didn't end on its blood-soaked streets. They traveled westward, carried in the breath of merchants, pilgrims, and defeated knights who limped back to Europe. And with them came rumors, not only of the loss of the Holy City, but of something far more dangerous slipping through the cracks. Some spoke of a child, smuggled out of the city in the chaos, hidden beneath the robes of a fleeing monk. Others claimed it was not a child at all, but a bloodline carried quietly in the veins of one family, guarded like fire in the dark. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. The idea of Jerusalem's lost heir was not buried with its fallen walls. It lived. The Templars, already regarded with suspicion by kings and bishops, suddenly became the keepers of this rumor. Imagine for a moment, you're a farmer in France hearing the Crusaders return, broken and worn. They tell you that the city of Christ has fallen, but then one of them leans closer, voice trembling, and says, "Not everything was lost. A seed remains." Would you laugh, or would you believe? In those days, faith and fear danced too close to separate, and this is where the cracks began to show. For some within the order, protecting a secret heir, or even the idea of one, was worth more than protecting Jerusalem itself. Others thought the tale was madness, a dangerous spark that could ignite rebellion against kings or even the Pope. But secrecy is a strange thing. The moment it is spoken, even as a whisper, it grows. The bloodline theory gave the Templars an aura both holy and threatening. To the faithful, they looked like guardians of destiny. To the powerful, they looked like conspirators. And while the Vatican tried to frame the fall of Jerusalem as divine punishment, the rumor of a living heir gave people hope. Hope that there was still a thread unbroken, a future king waiting in shadows. And hope, as every ruler fears, is the most dangerous weapon of all. In Rome, word of Jerusalem's fall reached the marble halls with a chill heavier than winter. But it wasn't the loss of the city alone that unsettled the Vatican. It was the rumor, the whispers of a bloodline still alive, carried westward on the tongues of knights and commoners alike. The Pope's advisors knew too well how a single story could unravel kingdoms. A lost heir meant legitimacy. A lost heir meant rebellion. And in a Europe where thrones already teetered on fragile alliances, even the hint of a child tied to Jerusalem's throne was enough to unseat kings. So the Vatican moved quickly, though not with armies. Not yet. Instead, they used something more silent, more venomous: informants. Letters were dispatched under seal, instructing bishops across Europe to listen carefully in taverns, in marketplaces, even in monasteries. Every rumor was to be traced back to its source. Every knight who had returned from the Holy Land was to be watched, questioned, sometimes broken. Imagine the scene. A weary crusader in Paris, still nursing wounds from battle, whispers to his family of a secret heir hidden by the Templars. Days later, he is summoned by church officials, pressed with questions he cannot answer. His words twist into evidence, his faith into suspicion. But here's the irony. By trying to silence the story, the Vatican gave it more life. When men disappeared after speaking of the heir, their silence was taken not as proof of lies, but as proof of truth. And slowly, a shadow war began, fought not with swords, but with parchment, sealed letters, and whispered names in candlelit chapels. The Templars now stood in a dangerous place, guardians of a rumor that refused to die, and the Vatican, instead of extinguishing the fire, had fanned it. The question was no longer whether the heir existed. It was, who believed enough to act on it? If Chapter 2 was the Vatican sharpening its knives, then here is where the Templars learned to hide the bread before the blade could fall. Imagine them, not as knights on horseback this time, but gathered in stone halls lit only by oil lamps, their voices low, not in prayer to heaven, but in whispers to one another. If Rome wants to bury the bloodline, we must build a chamber where the truth can breathe. The Templars had always been skilled builders. Cathedrals, fortresses, ports, stone was their language. But now, they began building in another way. Secret codes, rituals, and oaths that only the inner circle could understand. To an outsider, the Templar cross was just decoration on a cloak. But to those initiated, small details, a tilt in the angle, a line etched in the center, meant much more. They became maps of loyalty, signals of who could be trusted. And here's where the story takes its first twist. To protect the bloodline, they couldn't just keep it in one place. A name, a child, or even a single document could be lost overnight. So they split it. One brotherhood held the genealogy, another the symbols, another the safe routes. None of them could survive alone, but together they formed what later rumors would call the hidden circle. Imagine for a moment you are a Templar novice, brought into this chamber for the first time. The master hands you a parchment filled with symbols that make no sense and says, "This is only 1/3 of the truth. Guard it with your life, and never ask for the rest." That's how paranoia became protection. That's how secrecy became survival. What fascinates me most is this. While the Vatican spread fear by accusing them of heresy, the Templars leaned into that shadow. If they were going to be called secretive, they decided to actually become secretive. And in that irony lies their brilliance, because even today, no one can say with certainty where the bloodline was hidden or who carried it forward. The Vatican was never deaf. Whispers have a way of reaching Rome, even when spoken behind the thickest stone walls. A servant in the kitchens, a scribe copying letters, a guard who drinks too much and talks too freely, all became the eyes and ears of the Curia. And slowly, in the corridors of the Lateran Palace, rumors grew. The Templars are guarding something more than gold. At first, the cardinals dismissed it as exaggeration. After all, knights were supposed to fight, not protect dynasties. But when the same story surfaced again and again, fragmented, half-believed, it caught the attention of men who lived off suspicion. They began to ask quietly but firmly, "What secret are the Templars keeping from us?" The Pope's advisors knew how power worked. If the Templars were fractured inside, that crack could be pried open. So spies were not just sent. they were crafted. Novices whose loyalty leaned more toward the church than the order. Confessors who listened carefully when knights poured out their doubts. Even merchants on the road who would offer generous loans in exchange for news. The aim wasn't to discover the bloodline in one strike. It was to feed the Vatican with crumbs, enough to weave a picture. And perhaps most dangerously, the strategy began to work. Suspicion trickled back to Rome, that the Templars didn't all trust one another, that certain chapters in France or Portugal might be holding pieces of a larger puzzle. And here's the irony. The tighter the Templars tried to protect the secret, splitting it into fragments, cloaking it in symbols, the more visible it became to those who looked closely. Secrecy is like smoke. The more you try to trap it, the more it seeps through cracks, drawing attention to itself. So by the time we reach the late 13th century, we have two forces circling each other like wolves in the dark. One brotherhood convinced that only silence could protect the truth. Another, just as determined, that silence itself was the proof of guilt. And in between them, a secret bloodline, too precious to be spoken, too dangerous to be exposed. Trust is fragile. Inside the Templar halls, it had once been their greatest shield. A knight could ride into battle knowing the man at his side would guard his back without question. But when the Vatican's whispers seeped in, that certainty began to bend. It started small. A glance that lingered too long across the table. A brother arriving late to prayers, claiming he had been delayed, though no one knew why. Coins missing from a chest. Later found, but not without leaving a mark of doubt. And then came the confessions. Some whispered to priests loyal to Rome, uncertain whether their brothers still honored their vows. Others asked questions they should not have asked. Why do we guard certain relics in silence? Why are some missions given only to a chosen few? The Vatican's spies didn't need to invent stories. They only needed to press lightly against existing fears. Every question became an ember, every rumor a spark. And the fortress of trust that had held for decades began to smoke, then crack. Imagine sitting in a candlelit chapter house, the stone walls breathing cold around you. You hear the scrape of a chair, the cough of a brother you once trusted more than yourself. And suddenly you wonder, if he were asked by a papal envoy, would he stay silent? Or would he trade loyalty for absolution? This was the genius of Rome's pressure. It did not strike with swords or armies. It struck with shadows. Men fought battles in their minds long before they faced them in the open, and in those shadows, betrayal was born. By the close of the century, the order was still outwardly strong, fortresses intact, treasuries full, banners still bright red on white. But beneath the stone, cracks widened, and when cracks form in silence, all it takes is one push to bring the walls down. Not all betrayals arrive with daggers in the dark. Some begin with a whisper, a restless night, a single choice made in fear. The first cracks inside the order became faces, names, brothers who had once sworn eternal loyalty. One such man, Brother Anselm, carried scars from Acre and spoke often of how Rome had abandoned them. Yet it was Anselm who, after being summoned by a papal legate, slipped quietly into the envoy's chambers and did not return until dawn. No one spoke of it, but everyone noticed. His eyes, once fierce with defiance, carried something else after that night. Relief, or perhaps resignation. It wasn't only him. A knight stationed in Cyprus suddenly possessed more coin than his stipend could explain. A commander in Poitiers hesitated during a vote on whether to send relics further west, and days later, Papal messengers seemed to know the very words spoken in that private council. These were not grand betrayals at first. They were leaks, small, steady, and devastating. The Vatican did not need the entire truth. Fragments were enough. A misplaced phrase about a hidden seal, a muttered fear that not all relics belonged to Christ. When pieced together, these scraps created the outline of a dangerous story. And so the myth of an iron seal, a pact written not for heaven but for hell, grew stronger. Rome no longer asked whether it existed. They began to assume it did. All they needed was one desperate brother to confirm the rest. Picture a council hall lit by a single torch. A man sits across from you, a fellow knight, his hands trembling as he grips the table. He cannot meet your eyes. You know he has spoken to Rome. You know the seal is now a weapon, whether real or not, and you realize, with a heaviness you cannot shake, that the enemy is no longer only outside the fortress walls. It sits across from you, wearing the same cloak, the same red cross. The order had faced sieges, arrows, starvation, and betrayal from kings. But this rot from within, was worse. Because once trust dies, an army is already defeated, even if its banners still fly. In Rome, whispers never stay whispers for long. They change shape, gather shadows, and arrive at the papal court dressed as facts. By the time the fragments of talk from within the order reached Clement's advisors, they no longer sounded like doubts muttered in torchlight. They sounded like confessions. A papal scribe, hunched over a table late at night, wrote in careful Latin, "The brothers guard a seal of iron. They speak of it as pactum, not with men." That single phrase, lifted from a trembling knight's lips, would ripple outward like a stone thrown into still water. At first it was curiosity. Cardinals leaned closer during councils, asking, if such a thing exists, should not the Church hold it? Then it became suspicion. If the order hides it, do they not defy the authority of Peter's chair? And soon it was weaponized into fear. If this seal binds them to powers not of God, are we not at risk of heresy at the very heart of Christendom? The brilliance of this tactic lay in its vagueness. No one in Rome had ever seen the iron seal. No one could describe its size, its markings, or where it was kept. But absence is fertile soil for imagination. In their minds, the seal became a shifting phantom, sometimes a relic older than Solomon, sometimes a contract written in blood, sometimes even a coin struck with the devil's face. The Pope himself remained cautious, yet he could not ignore the weight of the idea. Too many reports arrived, each stitched from different corners of Europe, all painting the same dark picture, an order with secrets beyond the reach of the Church. And so, whispers became tools. Rome began spreading carefully shaped rumors back into the kingdoms. The Templars had grown too wealthy, too secretive, too proud. What began as fragments of paranoia inside a fortress now echoed across courts and marketplaces, turning ordinary people's awe into unease. The order had not yet fallen. Their coffers were still heavy, their banners still bright with the crimson cross. But the ground beneath them was shifting, not from swords or arrows, but from stories sharpened into daggers. For a brother of the temple, riding through the streets of Paris or Rome, it must have been a strange thing, still cheered by some, yet eyed with suspicion by many. To wear the red cross was to carry both honor and a growing curse. And in Rome's marble halls, one question tightened its grip with every whispered report. If the iron seal was real, who exactly held it now? By the time the leaves began to fall in Paris, the rumors had already grown legs. What started as hushed speculation in Roman corridors now marched openly into royal courts, dressed in the language of certainty. In England, clerks whispered to their kings that the Templars performed rites at night, far from consecrated chapels. In Aragon, noblemen swore they had heard confessions of brothers calling on a shadowy figure during initiation. And in France, the stories flowered most dangerously, that the order worshipped not the Christ, but a horned idol who promised them wealth. No one could produce this idol. No one could prove these rites. Yet the lack of evidence made the tales more alluring. What people cannot see, they imagine, and what they imagine, they fear. King Philip V of France, drowning in debts owed to the temple, seized upon the whispers with hungry precision. What better way to free himself than to paint the order as traitors to God? His envoys in Rome pressed the papal court, turning whispers into letters sealed with wax, each one demanding inquiry. In markets, the murmurs shifted into stories told by candlelight. My cousin saw them kiss the floor during their vows. A sailor swore they spat upon the cross. Every retelling stripped another thread of honor from the once bright mantle of the order. The Templars themselves fought back in silence. Their vows forbade them from shouting their innocence, and their dignity kept them from lowering themselves to gossip. They believed their service, their history, their blood shed for Jerusalem would speak louder than rumor. But in that silence, Rome and the crowns found room to write their own version of truth. And when a lie is repeated by enough voices, it hardens into something unshakable, something that kings and popes alike could wield as weapon. The iron seal, whether it existed or not, had already begun to serve its purpose. It was no longer an object. It was an idea that marked the Templars as men who might have bargained with the devil. And for rulers with debts or ambitions, that idea was far too useful to let die. The Red Cross was no longer just a symbol of sacrifice. It had become a target. Imagine for a moment. It's Paris, a cold autumn morning. The cobblestones are slick with rain, and outside the walls of the royal palace, whispers move faster than the wind. The people talk of debt, of betrayal, of the Pope's silence. But inside the palace, something far more dangerous is unfolding. King Philip's scribes bend over parchment, quills scratching furiously. They're not writing history, they're inventing it. Dossiers, page after page, filled with accusations. The Templars worshipped idols. The Templars spat on the cross. The Templars practiced forbidden rites. None of these claims have been proven. Some are wild fabrications. Some twisted from half-truths, whispered in taverns. But here's the cruel brilliance. Philip knows he doesn't need proof. He needs paper, signatures, and the weight of repetition. If the same lies are echoed often enough, they begin to sound like truth. Now picture the Vatican. Letters arrive sealed in wax, each one carrying the king's demands. Pope Clement V sits in Avignon, far from Rome, his health frail, his court divided. Should he defend the knights who once bled for Christ, or bow to a monarch whose armies stand just a march away? And here's the twist that still unsettles me. Some of these accusations weren't entirely invented. There are hints, tiny, ambiguous notes in old chronicles, that suggest a few Templars may indeed have performed rituals no one understood. Were these symbolic initiations, or something darker? We'll never know for sure. But Philip didn't care about nuance. He cared about power. The people in the streets? They only heard fragments. The knights are heretics. The Pope is investigating. Fear spread like fire in dry straw. Families who once sent sons to join the order now looked away in shame. That was the brilliance of the secret dossiers. They didn't just target the knights' bodies, they poisoned their reputation. And if you were there, standing by the palace gates, you would feel it too, the sense that a great betrayal was already in motion, written not with swords, but with ink. When the king's accusations left Paris, they didn't travel quietly. Messengers carried sealed letters along muddy roads, through mountain passes, across rivers. Each parchment was like a spark tossed into dry grass. In London, clerks unfolded the letters and read aloud. The Templars deny Christ. In Aragon, the same words spread through marketplaces. The Templars practice sorcery. In Cologne, whispers reached the cathedral steps. The Templars bow to a demon called Baphomet. Most people had never even seen a Templar up close. To a farmer in Burgundy or a merchant in Barcelona, the order was more rumor than reality. So when these accusations arrived, they landed on fertile soil. Fear is easier to plant than truth, and the genius, if we can call it that, was repetition. Philip didn't just send one letter, he sent dozens, each slightly different, each adjusted to match the fears of its audience. In France, he accused them of greed, in England, of treason, in Germany, of blasphemy. He gave every region its own reason to distrust the knights. Meanwhile, Pope Clement hesitated. He stalled, wrote careful replies, tried to delay the storm. But the storm no longer belonged to him. The rumors had become self-propelling. Preachers mentioned them in sermons, sometimes condemning, sometimes only raising concerns. Scholars debated them in universities. By the time Clement called for an official inquiry, half of Europe already believed the order was guilty. Imagine walking through a village square then, hearing two men argue. Did you hear? The Templars spit on the cross. No, I heard worse. They worship a severed head. And whether you laughed or feared, the damage was done. A reputation centuries in the making was unraveling, thread by thread, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of ordinary people. This is how the dossiers worked. They didn't need evidence, they just needed echoes. And the echoes grew louder with every retelling, until even silence from the knights seemed like proof. Inside the thick stone walls of a Templar commandery, life used to feel untouchable. The knights drilled in the yard, the brothers prayed in the chapel, the scribes copied ledgers in candlelight. But now, even here, the whispers seeped through like smoke under a door. At first the men laughed. Spit on the cross? Who invents such nonsense? Let them talk. Our deeds speak for us. But the laughter was nervous, too sharp at the edges. Because when lies are repeated often enough, they stop sounding like jokes and start sounding like possibilities. A sergeant asked quietly one night, "Brother, why has the Grand Master not answered these charges? Why does he keep silent?" The silence, meant to show dignity, felt instead like guilt. Doubt is a disease. It doesn't kill outright, but it weakens the body until infection does the rest. Soon, some knights began to suspect one another. A missing relic, perhaps stolen for secret rites. A late-night prayer, perhaps whispered to someone other than God. Every ordinary act gained a darker shadow. Worse still, merchants who once trusted the order now demanded gold in hand, no more credit. Towns that once welcomed the knights closed their gates early. Even servants inside the fortresses lowered their voices, as if speaking too loudly about their masters might bring misfortune. And the Pope's hesitation made it worse. If Clement truly believed the knights innocent, why not declare it outright? Why delay? That pause was all the world needed to decide for itself. One chronicler later wrote, "The fire began not from torches, but from tongues, and no wall of stone could keep it out." Imagine being a Templar then, standing guard on the battlements, hearing not the enemy outside, but the enemy within. Suspicion. Each echo of rumor struck harder than a sword, and the fortress, once their greatest strength, began to feel like a prison of doubt. Picture Rome in the early 1300s. Bells tolling across tiled roofs, parchment petitions piling up on desks, and messengers galloping through the gates with sealed letters. Pope Clement V sat at the center of this storm, a man caught between his conscience and the crown of France. Philip IV demanded blood. The French king had already seized Templars on his soil, locking them in dungeons and forcing confessions with methods too cruel to name. He sent Clement a message that was not really a request. "If you do not condemn them, Holy Father, you share their guilt." The Pope hesitated. He knew the Templars had served the Church for 2 centuries, fighting, building, lending money to fund crusades. Yet whispers reached even his ears: idol worship, secret rites, mocking the cross. Could he defend them without risking his throne, or worse, his soul? So Clement devised something that looked like justice but smelled like politics: papal commissions. Across Christendom, bishops were ordered to question Templars, but the questions were not open-ended. They were sharp, leading, crafted to produce one answer only. Did you spit upon the cross? Did you deny Christ in secret? Did you kiss your brother on forbidden parts? It did not matter that the knights swore innocence. It did not matter that their daily rule spoke of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The questions themselves painted guilt in the minds of listeners. And while Clement pretended to keep control, it was Philip's men who whispered in the ears of inquisitors, who prepared the accusations, who spread the evidence. The Pope, trapped in his own net, had little choice but to nod along. In monasteries and taverns alike, people began to say, "If even the Pope does not clear them, then surely the charges must hold some truth." It was not the sword that began to undo the Templars. It was the pen, dipped in ink blacker than night, scratching lies that sounded official because they carried the seal of Rome. Imagine a cold stone hall echoing with footsteps and whispers. This was no battlefield, no holy chapel. This was the theater of judgment. Rows of clerics in heavy robes filled the benches. Scribes with sharpened quills waited to catch every word. And in the middle stood men who had once carried swords for Christ, the Knights Templar. Their white mantles were gone. Shackles clinked at their wrists. Some still bore scars from dungeons in Paris, their eyes hollowed by weeks of darkness. Yet when the first names were called, the silence was so sharp it seemed the air itself held its breath. The questions, as promised, were cruelly simple. Do you admit to worshipping a false idol? Did you deny the Savior under cover of night? Will you confess freely before God and His Church? The room was not designed for truth. It was designed for theater. If a knight spoke boldly and denied every charge, the scribes twisted his words into arrogance. If another broke, trembling after months of torture, his confession was paraded as proof that all were guilty. One account tells of a Templar who, when asked if he spat on the cross, replied, "Yes, because they burned my feet until my flesh fell away." But the inquisitors only wrote down the first word, "Yes." Outside, rumors grew. Townsfolk whispered that the order's silence was proof of dark oaths. Mothers told their children not to look at the prisoners, as if their eyes carried curses. The same men once hailed as protectors of pilgrims were now branded corrupters of faith. Yet not all broke. Some stood tall, their voices carrying through the hall like iron. We served Christ, and we die for him still. And though their words were drowned in scribes' ink, they planted seeds of doubt among a few who listened. Seeds that would survive long after the trials ended. Because history shows, even when truth is smothered, it does not die. It waits. The trial may have been staged inside vaulted stone halls, but its echo spilled far beyond the courtroom. In the streets of Paris, people whispered by candlelight. Tavern owners lowered their voices, bakers glanced over their shoulders, and children asked why men who once rode with honor now stood in chains. Fear had a way of seeping into ordinary lives. Some believed the accusations, the tales of heresy, the stories of unholy rites. After all, wasn't it easier to think that knights who had grown too rich had also grown too proud? But others, especially the merchants who had once benefited from the Templars' banking system, knew better. They sensed the hand of politics, of greed, and of a king who would not rest until he broke one of the strongest institutions in Christendom. Yet the streets were not the only place the story traveled. In hidden rooms above candlelit chapels, rival orders gathered. The Hospitallers, cautious and pragmatic, debated what might happen if the Templars fell. Lesser-known brotherhoods, eager for power, saw an opportunity to claim abandoned lands and vaults. And in Rome, papal agents carried carefully phrased letters to noble courts across Europe, shaping the narrative before the ink on the confessions had even dried. The Templars themselves were divided. Some, broken by torture, clung to the faint hope that public humiliation might save their lives. Others, silent and defiant, refused to bend even when the rack stretched their bones. But the greatest division lay not inside the order, nor in the court, but in the people who watched, wondering whether they were witnessing justice or simply the theater of destruction. And in that uncertainty, new shadows found room to grow. While the trial dragged on, those who understood the game of power began to move their pieces. In Avignon, the papal court played a careful balancing act. Pope Clement V had to appear as the shepherd of Christendom, yet his every gesture was weighed against the iron will of King Philip. Letters were sent under seal, drafted in words that could be read one way by allies and another by enemies. It was not just the Templars on trial. It was the credibility of the papacy itself. The Hospitallers, meanwhile, debated fiercely within their own halls. Some voices urged compassion, insisting that if the Templars fell, it would be an insult to every knightly vow ever sworn. Others, more pragmatic, asked a colder question. What if their downfall meant more land, more wealth, more influence? Even within an order dedicated to healing, ambition had a place at the table. In England, Edward II hesitated, reluctant to hand over the knights who had guarded his father's coffers. But pressure came across the Channel. Papal messengers with veiled threats, merchants whispering about debts owed to the temple, bishops reminding him that obedience to Rome was not optional. Across Spain and Portugal, rulers calculated differently. There, the Reconquista was still alive, and kings remembered Templar blood spilled in battles against the Moors. If these knights were heretics, then who would man the frontier castles tomorrow? To dissolve them outright might have left Christendom's southern flank naked to attack. And so, while Paris rang with accusations, in other corners of Europe there were bargains, schemes, and secret oaths. The Templars' trial had opened more than one door. It was not just about crushing an order, it was about reshaping the map of power. The vultures were circling, But no one yet knew which carcass would be theirs to pick. The morning of March 18th, 1314, was cold enough that the Seine carried mist like a veil across the city. Crowds pressed against the stone walls of the Ile de la Cité, drawn by the promise of spectacle. They had heard whispers for years, confessions, heresies, rumors that the knights had kissed idols in the dark. But nothing compared to seeing the last of the temple's masters led into the open square. Jacques de Molay, once Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood shackled but unbroken. His beard, long and white, caught the wind. At his side was Geoffrey de Charnay, commander of Normandy. The two men had spent years in chains, but what remained in their eyes was not fear. It was fire. The papal legates had expected compliance. They had written the script. The condemned knights would confirm their guilt. The crowd would mutter approval, and the chapter of the Templars would close forever. But Molay refused. He lifted his voice above the noise, declaring not only his innocence but the innocence of the entire order. He called his forced confession a lie, extracted under pain. The crowd stirred. Some gasped, some crossed themselves, others whispered that the old knight had nothing left to lose. Yet in that moment, the stage belonged to him. "Before God and men," Molay shouted, "we are not heretics. We are betrayed." The words cut like iron through the fog. It was not just defiance. It was an accusation hurled at Pope and King alike. The executioners hesitated, but the order was clear. Wood piled high, pitch poured over it, the torch lowered. Flames rose, first crackling, then roaring, painting the walls of Notre Dame in hues of red and gold. Witnesses said Molay did not scream. Instead, his last words carried into the night air, a call for justice, for God to judge both Pope Clement and King Philip before the year was out. And here is where history and legend blur. Because before the year ended, both men, Clement and Philip, were dead. The crowd left in silence. Paris had seen a burning, but it felt more like a curse settling over Christendom. Word traveled faster than horse or ship. Within weeks, the story of Jacques de Molay's fiery end had crossed the mountains of Savoy, the harbors of Genoa, the forests of Germany. It was not just the execution of a man, it was the silencing of an entire brotherhood. Yet silence rarely stays silent for long. In taverns, peasants whispered of the Grand Master's curse. "Before the year is out," they repeated, "the Pope and the King will face God." To some it sounded like vengeance, to others prophecy. But when Clement V died of illness in April, and Philip IV collapsed in a hunting accident that November, the whispers hardened into belief. Merchants in Bruges swore they saw omens in the skies, red clouds shaped like a cross, drifting westward. Monks in Italy wrote of visions where knights in white cloaks stood guard before burning altars. Even in England, far from Paris, rumors spread that the Templars had not perished at all, but simply vanished into secrecy, carrying their treasures and oaths into hidden valleys. The Church, of course, tried to seal the narrative. Papal scribes drafted decrees insisting that justice had been done, that the temple was finished. But parchments could not erase memory. In the minds of many, the Templars were no longer an order. They had become a legend, one that frightened rulers and inspired dreamers. And perhaps most dangerous of all, some began to wonder whether de Molay's curse was only the beginning. If two of the most powerful men in Christendom could fall within a year, who might be next? The embers of Paris were gone, but across Europe, the fire was only starting to spread. It began as murmurs, passing words on market days, scratched symbols on the walls of monasteries. But as months turned into years, de Molay's last words began to take on a life of their own. They were no longer just the bitter cry of a dying man. They became a weapon. In Florence, preachers raised their voices from the pulpits. See how God has struck down kings and popes who betrayed his knights. Their words stirred not only the faithful, but also those who had long resented papal wealth. In the German principalities, local lords muttered that if the Pope himself could be cursed, then perhaps Rome's authority was not as unshakable as it claimed. What shocked rulers most was not the deaths themselves, it was the timing. Clement and Philip's fall so soon after the Grand Master's pyre felt to people less like coincidence, more like divine retribution. It made courts uneasy. Ambassadors drafted letters with careful wording, avoiding the name Templar, as if even ink could summon disaster. And then came the poets. Ballads of the king's curse and the Pope's doom spread through France and England, sung in taverns and carried by wandering minstrels. In their verses, de Molay was no longer a condemned heretic, but a martyr, wronged by men who sought gold and power. The songs painted him as a man who rose higher in death than his enemies had in life. The Vatican tried to crush these stories, but the harder they pressed, the more the tales grew. By the mid-14th century, entire generations believed the curse was real, proof that heaven itself had avenged the Templars. And in secret halls, sympathetic nobles began to dream. If the Templars were punished by kings and popes, perhaps their true allegiance had always been to something higher. De Molay's fire had burned down his body, but the curse lit a shadow across Europe that would not die. It left rulers cautious, rebels inspired, and the church forever wary of how a single dying voice could shape the faith of millions. By the middle of the 14th century, Europe was restless. Wars flared, plagues swept through cities, and faith in kings and popes faltered. Yet beneath the chaos, rumors stirred like a hidden current. The Templars had not truly died on that Parisian pyre. Sailors swore that white-sailed ships, bearing no flags, only the faint outline of a red cross stitched into their canvas, were seen slipping out of La Rochelle's harbor the night before Philip's men arrived. Some said they carried treasure. Others whispered they bore relics too dangerous to be left behind. But among the most haunting tales was this. The ships sailed west, into waters no Christian fleet dared cross. The Atlantic was no familiar sea. To most Europeans, it was a wall of storms, endless and unforgiving. But fishermen from Brittany and Basque lands told of strange driftwood that washed ashore, timbers carved in ways no European hand shaped. Even stranger, coins with markings no scholar could recognize were sometimes found in nets. To those who still believed in the Templar curse, these were not coincidences. They were signs. By the firelight of taverns, men whispered that the Templars had fled not into hiding, but into discovery. That perhaps they had followed maps never shown to kings, carried knowledge gathered in the East, or guarded a secret passed down since the Temple of Solomon itself. And in these whispers, the New World, centuries before Columbus, was not empty. It was already touched by the shadow of the Red Cross. For the Vatican, such rumors were dangerous. If people believed the Templars had found refuge across the ocean, then the Church's grip on history could unravel. And so chroniclers who wrote of such voyages often saw their manuscripts vanish, their words erased. But not all. A few pages survived, tucked into forgotten archives, speaking of a western isle where brothers in white mantles built chapels to await the Lord's return. No one could prove it. Yet proof mattered less than belief. And belief, once planted, spread faster than sails in a storm wind. In dusty corners of monastic libraries, there are maps that were never meant for sailors' eyes. They look like rough sketches at first, ink blots marking coasts, crooked lines tracing seas. But when you look closer, the outlines feel familiar. Too familiar for their supposed age. One parchment in particular, preserved in Lisbon's archives, showed a jagged western coastline. The archivist labeled it a fantasy. Yet beside that coastline, in neat Latin, was written a word that chilled even the boldest scholar: Insula Sacra, the sacred isle. Whose hand had drawn it? That was the mystery. Some claimed it belonged to Templar cartographers who had once mapped the Holy Land with astonishing precision. Others believed it was a copy of something older, knowledge inherited from Arab navigators, or even from the whispered wisdom of Alexandria's lost scrolls. But the symbol pressed in the corner was unmistakable: a red cross within a circle. Legends say these maps were never meant for kings or merchants. They were tools for initiates, guiding them to safe harbors and secret islands far beyond Europe's gaze. Some even whispered of stone chapels on windswept coasts, chapels that pointed east, not toward Rome, but toward Jerusalem, as if to remind their builders who they truly served. The Vatican knew of such maps. Reports survive of inquisitors seizing bundles of parchment during raids, then locking them away where sunlight could never reach. But scraps slipped through the cracks, finding their way into the hands of navigators centuries later. Columbus himself carried a map whose origins remain debated. Was it coincidence or inheritance? For those who trace the Templars' shadow, the pattern feels too deliberate. Every line, every symbol, another clue that the Atlantic was not empty, not unknown, but already crossed under the banner of the Red Cross. And here, the story deepens. If the Templars left maps, they left messages. And if they left messages, then perhaps they also left something far greater waiting on the other side. Symbols. That's where the trail often hides. You can burn parchment, lock away maps, but symbols have a way of surviving. They sit carved into stones, painted into stained glass, embroidered into banners no one thought twice about. One recurring emblem stands out in Templar ruins scattered across Portugal and France, a circle bisected by a serpent-like curve. To pilgrims, it looked decorative, maybe even meaningless. But when overlaid with fragments of those so-called fantasy maps, the curve matched the contour of a coastline across the Atlantic. Hidden in chapels, these designs whispered instructions only an initiate could understand. A chapel in Tomar had a pattern of stars on its ceiling, arranged not for biblical stories, but to mirror the night sky over an ocean horizon. Pilgrims prayed beneath it without suspicion, but to a navigator, it was a compass frozen in stone. Even manuscripts of prayer sometimes carried more than holy words. In the margins of a psalter from the 14th century, written in Latin, were tiny annotations, numbers beside verses, shapes beside letters. When decoded, the sequence aligned with navigational latitudes. Not sermons, directions. The Vatican called such things heresy, but that may have been a mask. Imagine sitting in a cathedral, hearing chants echo off the walls, while beneath your feet in the crypt, a fresco hid a coded chart of islands across the sea. The Church denounced the Templars as idolaters, but it is fair to ask, did they truly destroy every secret, or did some knowledge prove too valuable to discard? These coded legacies are the kind that make historians argue for decades. Some dismiss them as coincidence. Others say they point to a chapter of history not yet written, a chapter where the Atlantic wasn't just crossed, but claimed. And when you follow these threads, One question keeps pressing forward. If the Templars built messages into stone and scripture, then who were those messages meant for? Their enemies? No. They were meant for allies still to come. Because symbols are not just memory, they are promises. The story we're told in school begins in 1492. Columbus sails west, stumbles into islands he thinks are Asia, and history changes. But what if the footprints were already there? Not Spanish, not Portuguese, but familiar traces of the Red Cross of the Temple. Along the coastline of Nova Scotia, there are legends, stories whispered by the Mi'kmaq people long before Europeans began keeping written records. They spoke of visitors from across the sea, men in shining garments, carrying banners marked with symbols like crosses and stars. Some dismiss this as myth, yet the oral traditions are stubborn things. They last when parchment rots. And then, there is Oak Island. You've probably heard the modern legends, the pit that swallows fortunes, the endless hunts for buried treasure. But the earliest stories don't speak of pirates. They speak of something older, a construction too precise, too deliberate for wandering sailors. Stone drains, engineered tunnels, timber set with almost military discipline. Does it look like the work of shipwrecked fishermen, or of men trained to build fortresses across half the known world? Further south, in Brazil, Jesuit missionaries recorded something curious in the 1500s. Among the Guarani people, they found crosses already carved into rocks by rivers. Crosses not like the Catholic crucifix, but closer to the simple, bold design the Templars carried. Were they coincidence? Marks left by another culture? Or faint echoes of visitors who came and went before discovery was ever declared? Coins, too, appear where they shouldn't. A handful of medieval European coins, some from the 12th and 13th centuries, have been unearthed in North America. Too few to be proof, too many to be ignored. And hovering over all of this is a single haunting thought. If the order had reason to hide from kings and popes, what better sanctuary than a world no one else believed existed? Not conquest, not empire, but survival. A chance to guard their secrets where no inquisitor could ever reach them. Imagine standing on that foggy shoreline, the Atlantic rolling gray and endless, and finding a carved stone cross buried in the moss. Would you dismiss it as chance? Or would you feel the weight of centuries staring back? If you've ever heard of Oak Island, you probably know the story like a campfire tale, a mysterious pit dug deep into the earth, swallowing men, money, and hope for over 2 centuries. But peel away the later treasure-hunting frenzy, and what remains feels oddly familiar. The money pit, as it came to be called, wasn't random. It was a piece of engineering, layers of oak beams stacked every 10 feet, packed clay, coconut fiber, which doesn't even grow in Nova Scotia, layered carefully, as if to cushion or mark something. And then the flood tunnels. 5 separate shafts feeding seawater into the pit the moment anyone dug too deep. That isn't natural. That's defensive design. Think about it. Who in the medieval world had the knowledge to build fortresses with traps, drains, and hidden vaults? Who spent decades constructing castles in stone and underground chambers that could outlast armies? The Templars. Now, here's where it gets even stranger. Some of the earliest accounts describe carved stones found at depth, symbols that resembled a mix of Latin crosses and cryptic markings. One report even claimed the inscription translated to, 40 feet below, 2 million pounds are buried. Scholars doubt the translation. But what if the stone wasn't a riddle of riches, but a warning? And then there's the connection to Portugal. In 1570, maps already hinted at the location of Oak Island. Portuguese fishermen worked those waters long before the English colonists arrived, and who inherited much of the Templars' wealth and knowledge after their suppression. Portugal's Order of Christ. Could it be that Oak Island wasn't a place of pirates, but a continuation of the Templar story? Not a pit of gold, but a vault, meant to keep something too dangerous, too powerful from falling into the wrong hands. A relic, a gospel, maybe even the iron seal itself. Every generation that digs there seems cursed. Collapses, floods, explosions, millions of dollars spent, countless lives lost. Some call it bad luck. Others whisper that it's the shadow of the pact, a warning echoing through time. This secret was never meant for you. Close your eyes and picture it. The Atlantic spray on your face, the pit yawning dark and wet before you, and the feeling that someone, centuries ago, designed all this so you'd never reach the bottom. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. What if Oak Island's vault never held coins or crowns at all? What if the so-called treasure was ink and parchment, rolled tight and sealed in oilskin against time? Imagine for a moment. The Templars hunted in Europe, carrying not just relics, but knowledge, star maps drawn in red and gold, showing coastlines before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing west. Maps that linked the old world to the new. Some fragments suggest this. In the 19th century, a curious find emerged. Scraps of parchment pulled from the flooded tunnels. Barely visible letters on vellum. A single flourish, ink faded by centuries underwater. Dismissed by many, but too strange to ignore. And then there's the link to the Zeno map, a 16th century chart that depicted parts of Greenland and North America with eerie accuracy, long before explorers were supposed to know them. Some historians believe it was based on even older sources. Could those sources trace back to the Order of Christ? Or further, to the fugitive Templars themselves? Picture the vault not as a chest of jewels, but as a library buried in earth. Scrolls bundled in wax cloth. A compass rose marked with symbols that don't belong to any one culture. Latin crosses mingled with serpent coils. Hebrew letters alongside geometric stars. Knowledge that was not meant to be owned by kings or popes, but guarded by warriors sworn to silence. And here's the haunting part. If such maps existed, they would explain why secrecy was everything. A king with that knowledge could command seas. A pope with that knowledge could claim destiny. A rival order with that knowledge could reshape empires. The flood tunnels, the traps, the hidden layers, all of it may have been less about protecting gold and more about preserving time. The Templars were builders, yes. But they were also librarians of forbidden geographies. So when you hear Oak Island hunters dream of chests of jewels, pause for a second. What if the prize was far stranger? What if, sealed in that earth, was proof that the new world wasn't discovered, but remembered? And maybe that's why the earth itself seems to fight every attempt to uncover it. Because if those maps surfaced, they wouldn't just change history. They'd reveal that history was never what we thought it was in the first place. If Oak Island was a vault, the Vatican was a labyrinth, not of stone and mud, but of ink, ledgers, and guarded silence. Beneath the gilded ceilings of Rome, archivists worked with quills dipped in iron gall ink, copying, cataloging, and locking away the knowledge that flowed in from every corner of Christendom. Pilgrims saw basilicas glowing with candlelight. Few imagined the shadowy halls below, where parchment was sealed tighter than any treasure chest. And here's the unsettling part. Scattered references exist to Portus Occidentalis, a western harbor, mentioned in papal correspondence long before Columbus. Not a description, just a phrase, a slip of a quill, buried in routine documents. But why write of a harbor that wasn't supposed to exist yet? The Vatican had agents everywhere, merchants, envoys, even confessors traveling with knights. If Templar survivors carried maps or fragments of knowledge, where else could that intelligence land? Not in the public square, not in a king's court where rivals sniffed for advantage, but in the one place that thrived on secrets: the apostolic archives. Imagine walking those corridors, shelves of chained manuscripts, some marked with black wax seals no one dared to break. Priests moved quietly, their sandals brushing against marble floors worn smooth by centuries. The silence was heavy, almost physical, as if the very air warned you not to speak. What if, tucked among liturgical rolls and papal decrees, there lies a folder marked with nothing more than a serpent coiled around a crown? No explanation, no context. Just a reminder that something once existed outside the sanctioned story. The Vatican wasn't just a church. It was the most sophisticated intelligence network in medieval Europe. And like any intelligence hub, it thrived not by revealing what it knew, but by deciding who must never know. So here's the question. If whispers of a western harbor or a serpent crown reached those marble corridors, why haven't we seen the documents? Maybe they were burned. Maybe they're still there, sitting in a locked chest deeper than scholars can reach. Or maybe, more unnervingly, they were never meant to be read at all, only held, like a shadow, so power could be built on silence. And that silence still hums today. Clement V is often remembered as the Pope who crushed the Templars. But if you look closer, it's less about crushing and more about absorbing. He wasn't a fiery reformer or a warlike pontiff. He was cautious, deliberate, a man who spoke in measured tones and weighed every alliance like a chess piece. And when Philip IV of France demanded the suppression of the order, Clement stalled, not because he loved the Templars, but because he knew they held something more dangerous than swords: knowledge. The trials in Paris, with their confessions and burnings, were the theater everyone remembers. But in Avignon, away from the smoke, Clement's scribes quietly inventoried what the knights had left behind. Not just land or coins, but documents, scrolls, maps. One letter, half lost in the Vatican's archives, speaks of res occulta in portibus maris, hidden things in the harbors of the sea. It's maddeningly vague, yet to a pope already aware of the Templars' rumored connections to lost relics and forbidden texts, it was enough to pause before handing everything to the French king. Clement negotiated, as quietly as a shadow. He let Philip take the spectacle, the wealth, the public triumph. But the records, the fragments, the whispers, those he kept, sealed under papal authority. Some suggest this was the true bargain. The king fed his hunger for gold, while the pope tightened his grip on secrets. It fits Clement's style. He wasn't the kind of man to hold a sword. He held silence like a weapon, and silence can last far longer than fire. What's haunting is this. Papal notes from this period sometimes switch into cipher without explanation. Whole sentences in otherwise normal letters slip into coded symbols, almost like a serpent weaving through plain text. Why? To protect a name? A location? Or perhaps a pact? The kind that no court, not even history itself, was ever supposed to expose. If you were to walk into those archives today, you wouldn't find the words Devil's Seal scrawled across a document. You'd find half lines, cross-outs, codes, enough to suggest a shadow moving just out of sight. enough to wonder whether Clement's true legacy wasn't obedience to Philip, but something darker, stitched into the Vatican's vaults like a scar. So when we talk about the end of the Templars, was it really an end? Or was it a handover, a transfer of keys, from the knights who once carried them across the sea to a pope who knew the value of hiding what should never be seen? Not every secret stays buried. Even the Vatican, with its locked doors and its iron-sealed archives, could not hold every scrap. Picture a monastery library in the hills of northern Spain, late 14th century. Candles smoke, parchments lie stacked like forgotten bones. A young scribe copies a letter attributed to a dead Templar. In the margin, he scribbles something careless: clavis ferrum pactum, iron key of the pact. The phrase vanishes in later copies. But this one folio survives, and modern scholars still argue, was it a metaphor or a trace of something the papacy wanted erased? Then there are the oddities. A Venetian merchant's diary describing a papal envoy who carried a leaden box sealed with wax stamped in shapes no one recognized. A German chronicler writing about a ring that burned the hand of its bearer. Always passed from bishop to bishop, never destroyed. A French inquisitor who noted with unease that prisoners sometimes mentioned the seal as if it were more than rumor. It's like following smoke when you never see the fire. Each mention is brief, often cryptic, almost never in the main text but tucked in the margins, like whispers leaking through walls. And here's the strange part. The stories don't only describe the seal as an object. Sometimes it's a symbol of a pact, a deal binding the church not to God, but to something else. One legend even insists that the iron seal was pressed not in wax, but in blood, sealing a covenant no pope could easily escape. Is it possible Clement's bargain lived on, long after the Templars were gone? Not as a treasure, but as a contract, a tether tying the Vatican to a promise it could never admit aloud. If so, the leaks weren't mistakes. They were warnings. The kind that surface just enough to remind the world. Something still lies hidden, heavy as iron, waiting. And maybe that's why, centuries later, whenever rumors of the seal surfaced, the Vatican moved quickly, sometimes with silence, sometimes with fire. Because once people believe a pope signed a pact, not with kings or knights, but with the devil himself, faith begins to tremble. The Renaissance was supposed to be about light, rediscovering lost knowledge, reviving art, celebrating reason. But wherever there is light, shadows stretch too. Among the humanists in Florence and Rome, whispers of the Iron Seal began to resurface. Some scholars stumbled upon references in dusty manuscripts. Others, hungry for secrets beyond scripture, sought them deliberately. Picture a candlelit study in Venice, around 1490. Maps of the Mediterranean are pinned to the walls. On the desk lies a codex bought from a wandering friar. Between Latin prayers, a marginal note mentions a sigillum ferium, said to have been hidden in Avignon. The scholar copies the line carefully, his hand trembling. Because he's read the other rumors, that the seal was no ordinary stamp, but a relic forged with dark intent, a device that could sanctify even blasphemy if wielded by the right hands. Then in Prague, alchemists debated whether the seal was a key to unlock forbidden transformations. One claimed it could transmute the soul like lead into gold. In Florence, secret societies wove it into their myths, a covenant not with God, but with an older power, deeper than the church dared to name. Even explorers grew curious. Some Spanish sailors whispered that the Iron Seal had traveled with papal envoys across the sea, hidden among relics meant to bless new lands. Others believed it was carried east, toward Ottoman courts, where the Pope's agents struck strange bargains in the name of survival. But here's the unsettling thread. Almost every scholar who wrote openly about the seal either vanished, retracted his words, or left his notes burned. Inquisitors did not tolerate questions that cut too close to the Church's fragile foundations. The more knowledge spread, the more it was chased, silenced, erased. And so the seal became a paradox. The harder the Vatican tried to bury it, the more alluring it became to thinkers on the margins, men who believed that in the cracks of faith lay the real power of history. One Florentine chronicler put it best: "It is not the seal that frightens them, it is the pact it recalls." So what exactly did Clement V agree to sign, and why would its shadow still linger 2 centuries later? Was it a literal object, passed hand to hand, or a metaphor for the compromises of power, proof that even popes might bow to darker currents to preserve their thrones? Either way, the Renaissance taught Europe one lesson: secrets don't stay buried. They change shape, wear new masks, and wait for curious minds to follow. By the early 1500s, Europe was tearing itself apart over faith. Luther's hammer struck in Wittenberg, Calvin thundered in Geneva, and suddenly the Vatican wasn't the only power deciding what was sacred and what was heresy. And into that storm, the legend of the Iron Seal resurfaced again. Both sides used it as a weapon. Catholic loyalists whispered that Protestants had inherited the seal, that their new theology was nothing but an echo of the devil's pact once whispered into papal ears. Protestants, in turn, claimed the seal still sat in the Vatican vaults, proof that Rome had always been more about dark bargains than divine truth. Imagine the scene: pamphlets printed on rough paper, tossed into taverns and marketplaces, carrying crude woodcuts. One shows a pope holding a glowing black circle in his hand, with horns rising from behind his chair. Another shows a Protestant preacher, cloak torn, whispering into the ear of a serpent coiled around a cross. To common people who could barely read, the pictures were enough. The seal became shorthand for corruption, for betrayal of God, for power bought at a price too high. But here's the twist. In secret chambers on both sides, men really were searching for something. Protestant princes sent agents into libraries ransacked from monasteries, hunting for any manuscript that might reference the seal's origin. Meanwhile, the Vatican quietly dispatched envoys into Spain, France, even Ottoman lands, chasing down relic dealers and apocryphal texts that might confirm whether Clement's pact had been myth or dangerously real. The seal had turned into a ghost weapon. Nobody admitted to holding it, but everyone feared their enemies might. And beneath all the shouting sermons and fiery pamphlets was a quieter truth. Europe was obsessed with signs. A solar eclipse, a failed harvest, a plague outbreak, all became proof that the seal's curse was still at work. The Reformation was more than a clash of theology. It was a stage where old secrets, like the Iron Seal, were dragged out, reshaped, and hurled like stones. And for those who believed too deeply, whole villages burned. Families were torn apart by accusations that one man, or one priest, had called upon powers traced back to that pact of Clement V. The seal was no longer just a rumor. It was a weapon of fear, and fear spreads faster than any truth. If the Reformation had cracked Europe, the witch hunts shattered it into 1,000 pieces. By the late 1500s, villages lived in terror not only of famine and plague, but of each other. A sick cow, a spoiled loaf of bread, a sudden storm, all could be blamed on witchcraft. And behind so many of these accusations was the whisper, This power comes from the old pact. The iron seal, which no one had ever truly seen, became a phantom culprit. Preachers thundered from pulpits that witches were heirs to Clement's bargain, that they carried the devil's seal not in iron, but in their flesh. Birthmarks, scars, or even a stray freckle were called the mark of the pact. Imagine a market square at dusk, the air heavy with smoke, the crowd restless. A young woman tied to a post, her neighbors staring with a mix of pity and fear. The inquisitor holds up a parchment, claiming it bears the same sigil once etched on Clement's seal. He tells the crowd that she too carries the devil's mark, though no one can see it. The people nod, frightened, because fear is easier than doubt. But here's the cruel irony. In some inquisitors' own manuals, tucked between pages of Latin prayers, there are scribbled notes, sketches of circles, snakes, and strange lettering. Fragments that look eerily like the descriptions of the iron seal. Were these men hunting witches, or chasing echoes of the seal itself? Some whispered that the seal had split into pieces, shards carried across Europe, each embedding itself in a bloodline or a hidden relic. To burn a witch was not just to kill a neighbor. It was, in their minds, to destroy a living fragment of the pact. And yet, the hunts never stopped the fear. For every accused, 2 more names followed. Every execution seemed to deepen the sense that the seal's curse was everywhere, untouchable, embedded in the very soil of Europe. By the end of the century, tens of thousands were dead, entire villages emptied, and the seal, whether myth or memory, had become a symbol of Europe's darkest obsession. The belief that salvation could only be won by burning away shadows. But history leaves us a harder question. If the seal was only legend, why did so many live and die as if it were real? By the 1700s, the bonfires had burned out. Europe was tired of smoke and ash, but the seal didn't vanish. It slipped quietly from the hands of priests and inquisitors into the notebooks of philosophers, alchemists, and secret societies. Picture a candlelit room in Paris. Shelves of books, the smell of ink and heated wax. A group of men in powdered wigs bend over a table. Not witch hunters this time, but scholars. On the table, a sketch of a circle with a serpent biting its own tail, lines of Hebrew letters, and the words sigillum ferrum, the iron seal. Where the church had seen damnation, these thinkers saw a puzzle. Could the seal be a cipher? A forgotten key to Solomon's wisdom? Some claimed it hinted at the philosopher's stone, the power to transform not just metal into gold, but ignorance into knowledge. In Masonic lodges, whispers began. The seal was not the devil's pact, but a stolen secret of divine order, a hidden geometry of the universe. The Vatican had buried it, they argued, not to protect the faithful, but to keep the power to itself. Alchemists copied fragments of old texts, layering symbols on symbols, a snake for eternity, an iron circle for mortality, green stones for life. Some even built mechanical replicas, gears and rings meant to spin and lock, as if the seal were not a curse, but a machine. And here's the twist. In some libraries, you can still find these pages today. Diagrams that look suspiciously like early blueprints of electricity, or magnetic experiments, or even planetary maps drawn centuries before their time. Could it be that chasing the seal led to discoveries science would later claim as its own? Yet the seal remained elusive. Each generation gave it a new mask, curse, cipher, compass, myth, and always it carried the same pull, the sense that hidden beneath Europe's cathedrals and courts was a bargain too dangerous to name aloud. The Enlightenment promised reason, but even reason could not smother the shadow of the seal. If anything, it gave it a new disguise, not fire and brimstone, but parchment and ink. Because in the end, whether through witch hunts or through alchemy, one thing was always certain: the seal demanded attention. It refused to be forgotten. By the time the 19th century dawned, Europe was racing ahead. Steam engines, telegraphs, revolutions. But in the quiet corners of libraries and lodges, the seal was still there, humming like a hidden note. In Rome, whispers said the Vatican kept a drawer, locked with 3 keys, in which sat a fragment of iron too heavy for its size. Was it a relic of the seal or just a lump of ore? No one could agree, but every pope since Clement had ordered it never to leave the archives. Across the Channel, Masonic halls in London and Edinburgh told a different tale. To them, the seal was less an object and more a charter, a pact that had never been broken. They said its promise wasn't with the devil, but with knowledge itself. A brotherhood of those willing to look past fear, to unlock forbidden truths. And in America, strange echoes surfaced. Some early politicians were accused of carrying symbols suspiciously close to the seal in their private journals. Was it influence, coincidence, or paranoia? Even now, some conspiracy writers argue that the seal's geometry shows up on currency, monuments, and national emblems, hidden in plain sight. The world had changed, but the story hadn't. Every century found a way to retell it. A pope in chains of doubt, a bargain inked in iron, a symbol that refused to die. The seal no longer belonged to parchment or pyres. It belonged to imagination, to suspicion, to every whispered thought that power always costs something unseen. And maybe that's why it still lingers. Not because of what it was, but because of what it represents. The fear that our leaders are bound by secret promises we'll never read, and the hope that somewhere, hidden in vaults or beneath cathedrals, lies a key to the mysteries of history. So the next time you pass a church at night, or see an emblem carved in stone, ask yourself, is it decoration, or a trace of the seal, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to claim it? The seal did not die in the flames of Friday the 13th. If anything, its story only grew more powerful the further it slipped from sight. By the 18th century, Europe was buzzing with clubs, lodges, and societies that claimed hidden wisdom. Some wore aprons and compasses. Others met in candlelit basements, speaking in Latin and whispering oaths that felt older than the nations they lived in. Among these groups, one rumor stood taller than the rest: that the iron seal, or at least its copy, had become their talisman. To the outside world, it was just ceremony. To insiders, it was proof of a lineage stretching back to the Templars, and through them, to something even more ancient. Imagine a lodge in Paris around 1785. The revolution is brewing outside, mobs hungry for bread. But inside, men in powdered wigs stand around a table. On it lies a circle of iron set into wood. They don't touch it. They don't need to. Just seeing it reminds them they are part of something that survived kings, popes, and inquisitors. The same whispers drifted to Vienna, to Prague, and across the sea to Boston, where early Freemasons adapted the imagery. The all-seeing eye wasn't the seal itself, but some insisted it was a cousin. Another sign that power can only be legitimated by symbols older than law. Even skeptics admitted the geometry, the numbers, the secrecy, there was a pattern too deliberate to ignore. But here's where it gets murkier. In Rome, church officials warned that too many false Templars were rising. societies claiming authority from a relic that may never have existed. They argued that these groups weren't inheritors, but usurpers, twisting fragments of truth into fuel for rebellion. Still, even the Vatican's warnings only added gasoline to the fire. After all, why would the Church bother denying it unless there was something worth denying? And so the seal lived on, not as a single object, but as an idea, a forbidden pact, reshaped for each century. In darkened rooms and on national banners, it became both a curse and a crown, depending on who told the tale. By the late 18th century, the Iron Seal had turned into more than a relic. It was an accusation, a banner, and a ghost that haunted politics. Take Paris in 1789. Revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, and overnight, the symbols of monarchy came crashing down. Yet behind the chants for liberty, equality, and fraternity, rumors curled through the cafes. The lodges that had fueled the uprising were drawing on a forbidden source. A pact older than kings, older even than the papacy. Some whispered that the Iron Seal itself had been invoked in secret ceremonies that blessed the revolution with unstoppable force. Was it true? No document proves it. But a pamphlet circulated describing a circle of iron and flame said to have been raised in the catacombs beneath the city. Skeptics dismissed it as propaganda, but many citizens believed, and belief was enough to make the seal part of the revolution's mythology. Across the ocean, in the young United States, the same murmur followed the founding fathers. George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, both Masons, were painted by critics as heirs of Templar rights. The Great Seal of the United States, with its pyramid, its eye, and its Latin motto, was seen by some as the echo of the Iron Seal. Was it coincidence? Or was it proof that the pact, once whispered in medieval chapels, had slipped quietly into the DNA of a new empire? Meanwhile, in Rome, the Vatican could not ignore what was happening. Cardinals condemned these associations as Templar heresies reborn, warning that the Devil's Pact had resurfaced to destabilize Christian kingdoms. Yet each warning only gave the idea more fuel. After all, isn't the easiest way to keep a symbol alive to forbid it? By the dawn of the 19th century, the Iron Seal was everywhere and nowhere. It could not be found in a reliquary, yet its shadow lay across guillotines, constitutions, and flags. Some called it superstition, others called it destiny. But everyone agreed it had not died with the Templars. The 19th century was an age of nations being born, maps redrawn, and secret societies whispering in back rooms. And everywhere, the shadow of the Iron Seal seemed to linger. In Italy, the push for unification brought together patriots, poets, and priests, but also underground networks. The Carbonari, a secret society of revolutionaries, were accused by both monarchists and the Vatican of drawing on Templar poison. Pamphlets claimed their initiation oaths invoked not just liberty, but the serpent crown and the seal of iron. No evidence survives, but it made the Vatican nervous enough to launch new inquisitions. In Germany, during the rise of nationalist fervor, another thread appeared. Students' fraternities, sworn to build a united German state, carried banners with cryptic emblems, snakes, crosses, and broken crowns. To their enemies, it looked like a revival of Templar lore. To their friends, it was a romantic link to forgotten knighthood. Either way, it fed the myth that the Iron Seal had not vanished, but was being passed quietly from hand to hand, fueling revolutions. And across the Atlantic, Latin America echoed with the same suspicion. Leaders like Simón Bolívar were accused by their critics of being disciples of Europe's hidden orders. Some priests warned that the seal itself, had been carried into the jungles and mountains, blessing independence with infernal fire. Again, no proof, but the whispers gave the revolutions a strange aura of inevitability, as though a medieval oath was still unfolding. Meanwhile, the Vatican doubled down. Papal decrees denounced false Templars and pacts with the enemy of heaven, but the very act of denouncing gave life to the legend. The Iron Seal had become untouchable, not because anyone held it, but because everyone feared it might still be out there. The paradox was sharp. The Vatican wanted to bury the myth forever, but in fighting it, they kept it alive. And so by the end of the 19th century, the seal was no longer just a medieval relic. It was a ghost woven into revolutions, a phantom blamed for the birth of nations. The 20th century should have been the age of reason, science, industry, global communication. But instead, it was an age haunted by shadows, and among those shadows, the Iron Seal refused to die. In the years before the First World War, secretive lodges across Europe, some nationalist, some occult, claimed lineage back to the Templars. A few even printed pamphlets boasting that the Seal of Iron was their talisman. Historians dismissed it as fantasy, but it caught the imagination of young soldiers and poets who wanted to believe their fight had cosmic meaning. Then the war came, and the horror of the trenches seemed to prove the legends right. Men said they saw black seals carved on helmets, scratched into dugout walls, painted onto artillery shells. No one knew who placed them there, but every time, the whispers followed. The Devil's Pact was awake again. Between the wars, another layer grew. Occult groups in Berlin, Vienna, and Paris wrote of the seal as a key to dominion. Some of their members drifted into politics, men who would later drive the world into its darkest war. Even if the seal was only myth, it had become a weapon, a story that justified ambition, conquest, and cruelty. The Vatican, once again, could not ignore it. Secret documents from the 1930s show popes warning about false gospels carried under the banner of the seal. Priests were sent quietly to infiltrate these groups, to track rumors of an actual relic. Did they find anything? Records suggest silence, but silence in this case is as loud as a scream. And when the Second World War erupted, the Iron Seal seemed to echo louder than ever. A few Nazi officers were said to have carried rings engraved with a serpent biting its tail, the same symbol tied to the seal in medieval chronicles. Allied intelligence even filed reports on occult insignia being used as rallying signs in enemy ranks. Whether myth or artifact, the seal had slipped into the bloodstream of modern war. It was no longer just a medieval curiosity. It was a ghost, riding on tanks, stitched into flags, lingering in the chants of those who believed history itself was theirs to command. And as the guns of the Second World War fell silent, one question remained. Had the seal finally burned itself out, or had it only changed hands again? When the world split in two, East and West, Iron Curtain and nuclear fear, you might think ancient relics had no place. Missiles, satellites, and spies ran the game. But quietly, in the back rooms of both blocks, the Iron Seal surfaced again. Declassified CIA memos from the 1950s mention an artifact once linked to papal authority and whispered pacts. The language is vague, almost embarrassed, as though the analysts didn't want to admit they were chasing a legend. But the fact it was logged at all means someone, somewhere, thought the seal could still matter. In Moscow, whispers floated too. KGB files spoke of Western bankers gathering around Templar symbols. Soviet propaganda claimed the Vatican held a key to controlling Europe's finances, and that key, they said, was the seal itself. Was it true? Maybe not. But in the Cold War, truth mattered less than perception, and perception could move armies. Meanwhile, the Vatican walked a knife's edge. Popes of the era struggled to hold moral authority in a world obsessed with ideology and bombs. Yet inside the apostolic archive, new locks were placed on old manuscripts. Why? Some claim the seal had been mentioned in texts resurfacing from forgotten corners of monasteries. If even a shred of the seal's history was real, the Vatican needed it sealed tighter than ever. And here's where it gets stranger. In the 1960s, as the space race gripped the world, fringe researchers in Europe claimed the seal wasn't just about politics or demons. They said it was a map, a cipher written in iron and symbol, pointing to a location, perhaps even beyond Europe, perhaps a site of power that predated both Pope and Templar. Imagine that for a moment. At the height of nuclear fear, when humanity worried the world might end any day, hidden societies argued over a medieval relic as if it were the true lever of destiny. It sounds absurd. And yet, is it any more absurd than believing two men pressing buttons could end the world? The seal's shadow stretched into the Cold War, not by leading armies into crusades, but by haunting those who dealt in secrets. Whether CIA or KGB, monk or spy, the whispers remained the same. The pact had not ended. And the real question is, who, in that era of mistrust, truly held it? By the late 1970s, Western intelligence agencies had a peculiar problem on their hands. A coded manuscript, smuggled out of a Benedictine monastery in Spain. Its pages were brittle, darkened with age, and the ink had bled into spidery lines. Yet when analysts ran the text through early computers, the patterns didn't just read like medieval Latin prayers. They pulsed with mathematical precision. At first, no one wanted to link it to the iron seal, but the symbols scattered through the manuscript, an Ouroboros biting its tail, a papal tiara drawn upside down, and a serpent twined around a crown, were too close to the seal's legend to ignore. What unsettled the analysts most was the geometry hidden in the margins. Circles intersecting at precise angles, a grid that looked eerily like longitude and latitude, centuries before those were formalized. Some researchers whispered, "This isn't scripture, this is a map." But a map to what? One faction of the CIA believed it pointed to deposits of rare minerals, resources that could decide the balance of Cold War technology. Others thought it was nonsense, a medieval doodle. Yet another group, operating off the books, claimed the cipher hid something older, a gateway site, a place where the seal itself had been forged. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, the KGB ran its own tests. Declassified fragments show their linguists argued bitterly. Some called it dangerous mysticism. Others insisted it was an encoded instruction manual for power older than Christianity. The Soviets may not have believed in devils, but they certainly believed in leverage. And here's the strange part. During this same period, satellites from both superpowers picked up unusual magnetic anomalies in the Atlantic, right where fragments of the manuscript's cipher seemed to align. Nothing conclusive, but enough to keep the whispers alive. So imagine being in those rooms, cold light flickering over metal desks, men in suits pretending not to believe in superstition, while secretly running punch cards through IBM machines to decode what monks had written 7 centuries before. The seal, if it ever existed, was not only an object anymore. It had become an equation, a key, a reminder that power, whether nuclear or spiritual, always hides in the places no one wants to admit are real. And yet the Vatican, silent as ever, locked its archives tighter, as if to say, "You may search the skies and the seas, but the truth still rests here, under keys you cannot turn." By the early 1980s, whispers of the cipher no longer stayed locked in analysis rooms. A joint NATO task group, though never officially acknowledged, was assembled under the guise of naval exercises. But those exercises didn't unfold near Europe. They shifted quietly to the mid-Atlantic. The cover story said the ships were testing sonar against Soviet submarines, but in reality, their coordinates traced almost perfectly onto the strange grid discovered in the manuscript. An invisible lattice spread across ocean waters no one had cared about before. Sailors later spoke, in half-drunken confessions, of lights beneath the waves. Some described sonar echoes that bounced back like walls, though no island was there. Others remembered seeing priests on board, men in plain clothes, carrying crucifixes and small locked chests, as if the church itself had slipped agents into the mission. Official records? None. Just routine maneuvers, all logged and dismissed. But one ship's logbook, declassified decades later, contained a curious entry scribbled by a junior officer. Grid 17 anomaly, strong pull, orders to cut engines. Chaplain performed rites. Was it an undersea volcano? A magnetic rift? Or had they found something closer to what the cipher implied? A gate marked not by stone but by coordinates. The operation returned without public results. No artifact was unveiled, no map released. Yet for months afterward, naval intelligence analysts were briefed behind closed doors, and Vatican envoys were seen at NATO headquarters. A pairing that made little sense, unless both institutions had an interest in what lay under those waters. And here's where it grows uncanny. Soon after, the monks who had smuggled the manuscript in the first place? Silenced. Some disappeared into Vatican custody. Others retreated behind monastery walls and refused visitors. The seal, iron, serpent, papal, was never spoken of officially. But in the Atlantic, there are coordinates where compasses still twitch strangely, where local fishermen say the sea listens. And maybe, just maybe, one of those NATO ships carried something back in its hull. A fragment, a shard, a piece of iron etched with a crown. We cannot know. But the trail of silence that follows is louder than any revelation. The Atlantic winds still whisper, and the maps we thought we understood suddenly feel incomplete. Perhaps a Templar ship never crossed the ocean. Or perhaps it did, and what it carried has been hidden in plain sight all along. But here's the real question for us tonight. If the trail ends not in Europe, but on another shore, what part of history has been quietly erased? I'd love to hear what you think. Could the Templars have reached farther than anyone dares admit? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if you've made it this far into the story, thank you. Hit like if you enjoyed the journey. Subscribe if you'd like to keep traveling through the shadows of history with me. And remember, every click helps us dig deeper. Until next time, keep your eyes open. The past is never as silent as it seems.